Addiction isn't just about substances. It's a cry from the soul for meaning and connection. Carl Jung described addiction as a spiritual condition, not merely a physical or psychological one. One of his most famous contributions to the subject is the idea of the God-shaped hole, a deep, internal void that individuals attempt to fill through addictive substances or behaviors. He observed that for many addicts, the craving isn't just for the substance itself, but for a transcendent experience, something meaningful, divine, or whole. When Jung was consulted about treating an alcoholic patient who had failed every form of treatment, he remarked that the craving for alcohol was essentially a substitute for a genuine spiritual experience, suggesting that only such an experience could bring about deep transformation. This insight reframes addiction as a misguided attempt at spiritual fulfillment. The addict, often unconsciously, senses a lack of meaning or connection in life and turns to substances like alcohol, drugs, or other compulsions to fill that inner gap. The temporary sense of relief or euphoria offers a pseudo-spiritual experience, something that mimics connection, peace, or escape from the mundane. However, because the substance is not truly fulfilling on a spiritual level, the void quickly returns, and the cycle of addiction continues. Jung's perspective aligns with ancient spiritual traditions that view human beings as not just psychological or biological entities, but as beings with a spiritual dimension that must be nurtured. He suggested that when the spiritual aspect of a person is neglected, the psyche suffers, and addiction can arise as a symptom of this neglect. The term spiritual thirst that Jung used speaks to the human longing for transcendence, belonging, and purpose, needs that addictive behaviors try to meet in a counterfeit form. Modern psychology and addiction therapy often focus on behavior modification or chemical detoxification. While these are important, Jung believed they were insufficient for true recovery. If the spiritual need at the heart of the addiction remains unaddressed, the individual may remain vulnerable to relapse or substitute one addiction for another. Jung's letter to Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, reflects this view. In it, he emphasized that the only hope for transformation was through a spiritual awakening, a principle that became foundational to the AA program. What makes this idea powerful is that it shifts the narrative around addiction. Instead of seeing the addict as simply weak-willed or morally flawed, Jung's approach invites a more compassionate and holistic understanding. The addict is someone experiencing a profound inner emptiness, a spiritual hunger that deserves acknowledgement and healing. In this sense, the treatment of addiction becomes a journey inward, toward rediscovering meaning, connection, and the sacred within oneself. Recognizing the God-shaped whole is not about religious belief per se, but about reconnecting to something greater than the self, whether that be nature, love, community, or a deeper sense of purpose. Addiction, from a Jungian perspective, is not merely a behavioral issue or a chemical dependency, but a profound expression of the human soul's search for meaning. Carl Jung understood that behind compulsive use of substances or destructive behaviors lies a deeper existential vacuum, a disconnection from one's purpose, identity, or place in the universe. This craving for wholeness, often misinterpreted as a need for pleasure or escape, is actually a desperate attempt to make sense of life's chaos or emotional pain. The addict is frequently not even aware of this search. Instead, they experience an inner restlessness, a persistent dissatisfaction that no amount of consumption can resolve. Jung believed that when individuals are cut off in their inner life, their unconscious, their dreams, their symbols, they lose connection with meaning. In modern society, with its emphasis on external achievements, material success, and rational thinking, people are often discouraged from exploring their inner world. This disconnection fosters a spiritual and emotional emptiness, which addictive behavior tries to fill. Substances or habits become substitutes for the deeper fulfillment that comes from understanding oneself, finding a sense of belonging, or living in alignment with an inner purpose. For Jung, the psyche is constantly seeking individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all aspects of the self, both conscious and unconscious. Addiction can be seen as a detour on this path, a false substitute for the transformative journey of self-discovery. The addict is, in a sense, trying to resolve a crisis of identity or meaning, while confronting the painful truths and inner conflicts that need integration. The substance offers temporary relief, a momentary illusion of unity or peace, but ultimately keeps the individual trapped in a fragmented state. When the pursuit of meaning is diverted into substance use, the symbolic function of the psyche, its ability to create personal significance and spiritual insight, is bypassed. The addict becomes stuck in a cycle of external gratification, never touching the inner truth they are truly seeking. Jung suggested that such a condition cannot be healed by logic, willpower, or medication alone. The individual must engage with the symbolic language of the unconscious through dreams, creativity, or spiritual practices to reconnect with what gives life genuine depth and purpose. This interpretation offers a powerful reframing of addiction. Rather than treating it solely as a pathological condition, it is seen as a distorted form of yearning, a misdirected search for transcendence. Jung's emphasis on meaning-making implies that lasting recovery involves more than sobriety. It requires a reawakening of the soul. The person must find or create a narrative in which their life makes sense again. Without such a narrative, the addict may always feel as if something essential is missing, even if they manage to stop using. In Jungian therapy, helping an addict involves guiding them to explore their inner world, confront their fears, and discover the symbolic meaning behind their cravings. Through this process, the addiction is not just removed, but transformed into a catalyst for psychological and spiritual growth. Carl Jung's concept of the unconscious and the shadow plays a central role in understanding addiction from a depth psychological perspective. The shadow represents the parts of ourselves that we reject, repress, or deny. Impulses, memories, desires, and emotions that we deem unacceptable or incompatible with our conscious identity. These hidden aspects do not disappear. They remain buried in the unconscious, influencing our behaviors in subtle and often destructive ways. In the case of addiction, the compulsion to use substances or engage in self-destructive patterns can be viewed as the eruption of these suppressed shadow elements into consciousness. Addiction often arises not merely from trauma or pain, but from a failure to acknowledge and integrate one's full psychological reality. A person may repress anger, grief, shame, or fear due to societal conditioning or early life experiences. Over time, the psyche becomes divided, what Jung called a splitting of the personality. The unacknowledged parts of the self do not vanish. They build pressure in the unconscious and eventually manifest as symptoms, one of the most common being addiction. The substance becomes a coping mechanism, a means of avoiding the confrontation with these darker, painful truths. The shadow is deeply personal but also collective. Cultural taboos and moral ideals shape what individuals are allowed to express openly. Addicts often carry an enormous amount of inner conflict, guilt, and alienation because they are acting out what society labels as unacceptable. But Jung would argue that these unacceptable behaviors are symptoms of a deeper split in the psyche, one that will continue to dominate until the shadow is brought into awareness. Suppressing these elements only makes them stronger. The more they are denied, the more control they exert from the unconscious. Confronting the shadow is a terrifying but necessary step in healing addiction. Jung called this process shadow work, the conscious integration of one's hidden and rejected parts. When a person begins to face the uncomfortable truths within themselves, perhaps through therapy, introspection, or dream analysis, they reclaim the energy that was once bound up in repression. This reclaimed energy can then be directed toward creative or meaningful pursuits. The addiction, once a powerful force of self-destruction, can begin to lose its grip as the person becomes more whole and self-aware. In Jungian terms, healing addiction involves more than detoxification or behavior management. It demands a psychological and spiritual transformation, an inner alchemy in which the fragmented self becomes unified. This integration process includes not just the light aspect of the personality, but also the dark, chaotic, painful ones. Through this process, the addict can begin to understand their substance use not as a moral failing, but as a symbolic message from the unconscious, a cry for attention, a demand for wholeness. By bringing the shadow into the light of awareness, the addict can begin to develop a more authentic and integrated sense of self. This psychological wholeness reduces a compulsive need to escape, offering the individual not just sobriety, but a deeper connection to their own humanity. Carl Jung's view on addiction emphasized that true healing could not occur without a profound inner transformation, which he described as a spiritual awakening. He believed that addiction was fundamentally a spiritual disorder, a loss of connection to the deeper aspects of the self and the universe. The individual caught in addiction is not just physically dependent, but is spiritually disoriented, cut off from meaning, purpose, and an experience of the sacred. The temporary high that substances provide mimics a spiritual experience, but is fleeting and artificial. Jung proposed that only a genuine encounter with something greater than the ego, something numinous, could replace the addictive craving with something truly fulfilling. This insight was clearly reflected in Jung's famous letter to Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, where he wrote that the craving for alcohol was the equivalent of a spiritual thirst, an attempt to experience wholeness, transcendence, or God. He stated that spiritus contra spiritum, meaning that the spiritual experience, spiritus, is the only power strong enough to overcome the spirit alcohol that hold the addict captive. This idea became foundational to the 12-step model, which begins with the acknowledgement of personal powerlessness and the need for a higher power. Jung did not define the spiritual experience in religious terms, nor did he tie it to any one doctrine. Rather, he understood it as a deep inner event, a direct experience of the sacred or the self, which transforms the individual's orientation toward life. It might occur through dreams, synchronicities, profound emotional breakthroughs, or contact with archetypal symbols. Such experiences have the power to reorient the psyche, giving the person a renewed sense of direction and purpose. This is a kind of inner event that can shift the compulsive desire for substances into a quest for deeper truth and wholeness. Addiction often stems from a kind of inner deadness, a lack of vitality or connection to life. The spiritual awakening reanimates the inner world. It gives the person a reason to live, something to serve or strive for beyond the self. This is not about escaping pain, but about integrating it, understanding its meaning, and discovering strength in the process. The spiritual experience, in Jung's view, restores contact with the self, the central, organizing principle of the psyche that holds the key to individuation and psychological growth. In many cases, those recovering from addiction report such transformative moments, a sense of surrender, a flash of insight, or a profound feeling of connection to life that defies rational explanation. These experiences often mark a turning point where the addictive cycle begins to loosen. Jung's contribution was to recognize that such moments are not just emotional or psychological. They are spiritual in nature, and they are essential. Recovery, then, is not just about stopping a behavior, but about discovering a new way of being in the world. The addict does not merely need discipline or support. They need awakening, something that touches the soul and makes life worth living again. Addiction, in Jungian psychology, is understood as a failure of the ego to manage the inner world, leading to a state of fragmentation and disconnection from the self. The ego, which serves as the center of conscious identity, is meant to mediate between the demands of the unconscious and the external world. When the ego is weak, rigid, or overwhelmed, often due to unresolved trauma, emotional repression, or existential confusion, it loses its ability to hold the psyche together in a healthy balance. In this weakened state, individuals may turn to substances or compulsive behaviors as an attempt to regulate emotions, cope with inner chaos, or simulate a sense of control and unity. Jung believed that beneath the ego lies the self, a deeper, more comprehensive center of the psyche that represents wholeness, integration, and meaning. The self is not just a sum of conscious awareness, but includes the unconscious as well. When someone is disconnected from the self, they often feel lost, anxious, or incomplete. Addiction can be seen as an unconscious drive to return to the self, to feel whole, at peace, or spiritually connected. However, instead of moving inward toward genuine self-discovery, the addict reaches outward toward external substances that offer only temporary relief and further fragment the psyche. This disconnection creates a cycle. The ego, rather than being the stable captain of the inner ship, becomes reactive and defensive. It tries to maintain control by suppressing uncomfortable feelings, ignoring inner conflicts, and avoiding deeper questions of purpose or identity. The more the ego avoids these aspects, the more power they gain in the unconscious, eventually manifesting as addiction or other symptoms. Jung called this a condition of ego inflation or ego alienation, where the ego either overestimates its control or feels entirely powerless. Healing addiction from this perspective requires the ego to relinquish its illusion of control and enter into a dialogue with the unconscious. This is not a passive surrender, but an active engagement with the inner world through practices like dream work, active imagination, art, meditation, or psychotherapy. These methods help the individual access symbolic material from the unconscious and begin to integrate it consciously. As this process unfolds, the ego becomes more resilient and flexible, able to serve its proper function without collapsing or clinging to false sources of stability. Jung viewed this process as a journey toward individuation, the realization of the self through the integration of all parts of the psyche, including the shadow, the anima/animus, and the archetypal forces that shape human experience. As the ego aligns with the self, the inner fragmentation begins to heal. The addict no longer needs substances to simulate connection, because a real sense of connection is developing from within. This connection brings a renewed sense of vitality, direction, and meaning, allowing the individual to live more authentically and creatively. The breakdown of the ego in addiction is not merely a failure, but an invitation, a symbolic death that can lead to psychological rebirth, if the individual is guided inward toward the deeper organizing center of the self. In the end, addiction is not a simple weakness, but a reflection of a deeper spiritual longing. Carl Jung's insights offer a path toward healing by reconnecting with the self and integrating the unconscious. True recovery lies not in the avoidance of substances, but in the transformation of the soul, rediscovering meaning and embracing wholeness.